Hey folks, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here. A couple things. First of all, I'm sort of the pre-game show. Okay, Trina's the main act. Trina's why you're here. Okay, so I'm just warming things up, getting the room, awake. We'll go back one. Other thing, and with grad students, they're going into their thesis defense. They're doing their exit seminar, and I always have to remind them that they know more about their thesis and the topic than anybody else in the room. That's not the case today for Trina and I. See, Trina's name at the front, my name at the end. Everybody in the middle they're all experts on wildlife crime. We are experts on doing evidence syntheses, okay? So there may be some questions to get deflected to various folks in the audience. So with that, and I see some faces from yesterday, but I just want to let folks know that there was a fantastic evidence-based conservation discussion that happened in this room yesterday. There were presentations of a variety of topics. And if you're in this building and know something about what Bill does, you're obviously familiar with the importance of ensuring that evidence is used to inform and support decision making. And that's really what this is all about, what we're going to talk about today. Bringing together, synthesizing what's known about topics related to wildlife crime to help guide on-the-ground action, to help guide funding decisions. And with that, I want to acknowledge the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but not only as partners on the research, but also as funders and really the inspiration for the work. So with that, away we go. So just the usual doom and gloom slides to start things off. I think everybody in this room is well aware of the fact that we have a variety of taxa across the planet that are imperiled, doing relatively poorly. The distribution of sort of threat status varies. For example, in North America, Europe, and Central Asia, we're doing okay. We certainly have room for improvement there, but there are other parts of the world where biodiversity loss is really, really quite grim. Also coincident with that those are areas where there's known areas of wildlife crime. Just to help you break down some of those boxes, the dark sort of, I'm going to call it purple, but whatever rosy purpley color that is, the main chunk of the pies, that's habitat loss and degradation. So key driver across the board. But another one I want to point out is this orange here, which you can see is quite substantial here. Now that's overexploitation. Some of that is just mismanagement, okay? Natural resource management agencies allowing liberalized harvest, too much harvest, not keeping track of things. But a portion of that is also illegal harvest trade. So that sort of zooms us into what we're focusing on today. This is a standardized seizure index, and through time you can see that things aren't getting particularly better on the whole, at least for wildlife, and wildlife using that term broadly, including plants. Trina's going to dig into this slide more, so I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that there are counter wildlife crime interventions that are conducted around the globe, mostly by government authorities, but sometimes that can be at the federal level. It can be at the international level as well. If we think about Interpol, the national level, it can be at the state, regional governments, or even at the community level or a specific park. The variety of different actions that can be undertaken. A history lesson, and this could be a history lesson for those that weren't, this is also a history lesson to yesterday. But this idea that it's well known that conservation decision makers do what's familiar, do what's comfortable, do what they've always done. Change is hard, and there are reasons why that change is hard at the level of the individual, but also at the institutional level. So there's a lot of institutional inertia. We have always done it this way, and so trying to change things, bring new evidence to the table is difficult, especially when that new evidence might suggest that what you've been doing is perhaps not the most effective use of funds. In fact, it may be counterproductive. It's possible that what you're doing under the auspices of good, you think you're doing good, may in fact be doing more harm. And this paper, which was a survey of land managers in the UK, really, I think, sort of shook things up and got Bill and others thinking about the need for evidence-based conservation. Supporting evidence-based conservation is a whole suite of conservation decision-making tools. They include things like conservation prioritization, structured decision-making, and evidence synthesis. And that's really what we're going to be sharing with you today in evidence synthesis. There's lots of different approaches to evidence synthesis. The conservation evidence toolbox that is developed in this building is an example of, and the synopses that spin off of that, that's evidence synthesis. You can do rapid reviews, systematic maps, and so on. Today, you're going to hear about a systematic map and a systematic review, and Trina will tell you more about that.
Hello, everyone. So I don't have as good of a teacher voice as Steve. Yeah, so I don't know if I can stand here. I might need to come a little bit more closer to the microphone. So as Steve mentioned, we're going to focus most of the results that we're going to talk today about are really related to a systematic map and a systematic review that stemmed off of that system. And so we follow for this the guidelines and standards that are set out by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence to do these. Okay, so there's a systematic map, and with the systematic map, what you're trying to address is a question. You're really trying to ask the question, what evidence exists on that topic? You're not necessarily trying to address a specific, answer a question. It's just, what does the evidence exist? And there's two main aims. You're trying to figure out, what does the evidence landscape look like? You're describing that. And then you're also trying to identify what knowledge clusters and gaps exist. So a cluster is a subset of that evidence, larger evidence base that might be more comparable, that you can then do further secondary review on, right? You can dive a little bit deeper into that because the questions might become a little bit more narrowly focused. With a gap, it's essentially where you might want to direct potential future primary research towards to fill that gap. With a systematic review, what you're trying to do is ask the question, what does the evidence suggest? So you're trying to answer that question, right? So it could be, what is the impact of a particular threat, or what is the effectiveness of that particular management intervention? And so we're going to focus to start with on the systematic map. So we, as Steve mentioned, in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which was a big contingency over there, we developed this question to answer the question, what is the evidence that counter-crime interventions are effective for conserving African, Asian, and Latin American wildlife directly threatened by exploitation? And we, alongside with the Fish and Wildlife Service, developed this question in the context of the plant and animal species targeted by the agency's international grants programs and law enforcement activities. And so there was a few aims, but primarily it was to help Fish and Wildlife Service understand and build the evidence base that supports their grant-making programs and decisions. This is also just a broader relevance to, governments and non-government organizations who are also making these kinds of decisions as well. Okay, so the team. So Steve mentioned, so we are the CUBC team here, right? We bring our evidence synthesis we're specialists in that field. We are not the topic experts. So we're not topic experts in wildlife crime or wildlife crime interventions. Although Siri here in the audience, I'm going to point out Siri's here, she had some topic expertise, so we were hired her to help us. But really what it involved is an external advisory team. So these, we were very fortunate to have these people establish this wonderful team. So we relied on these folks here to help us. There's a number of roles that they played, but essentially they brought to bear, what could we be, helping. It started with a question formulation, but really helping us develop our frameworks that we used in terms of what we were defining a counter-crime intervention, what outcomes should we be considering, but more importantly also, where should we be looking for this evidence and helping us developing our search strings and whatnot. So we had stakeholders from Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as people from within the Office of Law Enforcement who have topic expertise on this. We had academics, we had government, non-government organizations. We had people who had on-the-ground experience with these types of interventions. And yeah, I can't say anything else about it. Remained engaged the entire time throughout this entire process, and they still remain engaged on kind of projects that kind of stemmed off of this too. So we've been really fortunate. Okay. So I don't have time to really kind of dive into all the methods. That'll probably a little bit. So I just want to encourage you to check out. This was so following the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence Guidelines, we developed an a priori project plan, or what's referred to as a protocol. And this is basically setting out how exactly we're going to conduct the systematic map. Ideally, right before you start doing anything, to really make sure you've thought through everything. And so we spent a number of months with our advisory team in developing our frameworks that we used for this. And then we published it as a stage 1 registered report with ecological solutions and evidence back in September of 2021. Okay, so although I won't go into the methods, some key aspects to kind of give you an idea of the scope. What was the scope of the studies that we were including in this systematic map? And so to do that, we identify what's referred to as PICO components. And these are just 4 key elements needed to specify the question, and it helps us with our search string as well as our eligibility criteria. And it relates to the relevant population, the relevant intervention, the relevant comparator, and outcomes. So I'm just going to go through each of those just to kind of give you an idea. So in terms of the relevant population or subject, we included any wild animal and plant species or species groups native to Africa, Asia, or Latin America that were targeted by the Fish and Wildlife Service international activities. And here's just a few examples of some of those species from some of those species groups we were including. In terms of intervention, we are looking at the establishment, adoption, or implementation of any counter-wildlife crime intervention, either implemented alone or in combination with another counter-wildlife crime intervention. For conserving animals and plants directly threatened by exploitation. And this could have been anywhere along the wildlife crime continuum. So from wildlife collection through to harvest, process, transport, trade, or consumption. But we also included human-wildlife conflicts in relation to like pest control or retaliatory killings, as long as the interventions that were implemented related to a counter-wildlife crime intervention and not something just specifically related to species management. Okay, so to dive into these a little bit more. So as I mentioned, we spent a good amount of time with our advisory team in developing this framework for our counter-wildlife crime interventions. We came up with 3 broad groupings for counter-wildlife crime interventions. And these groups were really developed to be in line with the existing functional divisions of work in countering wildlife crime. And so the 3 main groups were wildlife population-centric actions, here. So these are actions aiming to prevent the loss of target wildlife species from its habitat by illegal harvesters. We have offender and business-centric actions focusing on individual offenders and businesses at any stage of the wildlife crime continuum. And lastly, wildlife product-centric actions. So actions targeting the wildlife product itself and the transfer of that product at any stage of the wildlife crime continuum. And then within each of those, we had further subcategories to just kind of get a finer scale. And so for wildlife population-centric actions, we had direct guarding of wildlife, device removal and destruction, control of exit and entry points, patrols, or interception of illegal harvest attempts. For offender and business-centric actions, we had intelligence-led operations, immediate sanctioning following encounter with the offender, prosecution, sanctioning following prosecution, individual communication. So that could have been just individual communications with offenders in terms of legality, illegality, or targeted communications with repeat offenders, or rehabilitation of offenders, not species, but offenders. For wildlife product-centric actions, we had information sharing and analysis, confiscation, deposition and destruction, and awareness raising. Okay. So in terms of a comparator, ideally studies would include some sort of comparison in their evaluation of a crime intervention, right? So this could be ideally the absence of an intervention. So you can say, what happened in the absence of that, not having that counter-wildlife crime intervention there? So that could have either been spatial locations that did not receive it, or time periods that did not receive that counter-wildlife crime intervention. We could have included comparisons with another intervention, or different levels of the same intervention. But we did not at this stage exclude anything based on the presence or absence of a comparator. We instead wanted to narratively describe what that evidence landscape looked like to get a better sense of what kinds of designs do we have here. In terms of outcomes, we had a few. So we're looking at measures of change in biological outcomes. So these are considered those kind of ultimate conservation targets that we're aiming for, right? So overall status of the relevant population or species of concern. But we also included threat reduction outcomes. So these are indicators of reduced threats on target species. So do we see a reduction in poaching incidents? Do we see a reduction in wildlife crime and trade? Okay, so to get into the findings, so we're going to start with describing what the evidence landscape looked like for this topic. So in overall, we had a total of 530 studies from 477 articles included in the map. So an article just means it could have been a peer-reviewed publication, it could have been a report, it could have been a thesis, so included both commercially published and gray literature. But within a given article, we could have had independent studies reported. So if they were presented as case studies, they weren't directly compared, they're just presented separately, we treated those as independent studies. As you can see, this is just the number of articles per publication year. We see over time, we generally see an increase in publications and with majority in the last approximately 10 years or so. And we found that commercially published literature had a greater proportion in the evidence base compared to grade literature, but we were actually quite comparative to other reviews we've done. That's actually quite good for grade literature. In terms of locations, we found a large evidence base found for Africa and Asia, but a relatively smaller evidence base found for Latin America. I just wanted to point this out. So we used, there's a Shiny app that was created by Neil Hadaway et al. It's called Evi Atlas, and it just requires you to upload a CSV file, an Excel file, and we make this CSV file available with our final report. And what you can do is upload it. It's got all the coded and metadata from what we extracted, and you can, and it includes the Latin longitude of all the studies that we extracted. And so you can populate this interactive spatial location map, and you can make it interactive and like hover over these points. This is just a static image of it, but you can hover over those points. You can pull up that metadata, so you can interrogate it yourself. So if you're really interested in it, and it also, the Shiny app allows you to do simple descriptive statistics. So you can do simple 2-variable plots if you're really keen and you want to go interrogate the data a little bit more. So that is available with our final report. Okay, in terms of counter-wildlife crime interventions that we found, so if we just first focus on those 3 broad groups, we found that the most common broad group of counter-wildlife crime interventions were related to wildlife product-centric actions, followed by wildlife population-centric actions, and then offender and business-centric actions. And then if we look at within each of these more closely, so these are just frequency plots essentially. So each of the panels is a level 2 wildlife population-centric action with their level, kind of finer scale categories underneath. And we've stacked these frequency chart, these bar charts by the actors who are implementing those interventions. So were they people who had law enforcement authority? Were they trained or given authority to make arrests or to confiscate items or to be able to prosecute or sanction? So it could have included prosecutors, for example, depending on the action. Or were they people who are non-law enforcement authority, or a mixture of those two? And in some cases, it was just not reported or is unclear in the paper. I just want to make a quick note that panel D there has a different scale compared to everything else. If we populate this, we see that for the wildlife population-centric actions, the most common wildlife crime that was implemented were related to patrols, in particular patrol teams. And we can see across these interventions, most of the time, law enforcement actors were the ones implementing these activities. In terms of offender and business-centric actions, most commonly, we see immediate sanctioning of offenders in the form of arrests or confiscated items. And similar to the wildlife population-centric actions, most of the time, these are people with law enforcement authority in terms of like prosecutors. So I want to make a quick note here. So we had 2 interventions that we had identified that did not have any evaluations found in the literature base. And these were 2 interventions that were told to us by the some folks on our advisory team on the Office of Law Enforcement as commonly used interventions. And so we did not find anything related to these, unfortunately. Okay, and lastly, wildlife product-centric actions. These were dominated by information sharing and analysis. So these were kind of related to hotspot and trade analysis. So just a quick note to kind of explain this one. So one of the information sharing and analysis in and of itself may not be considered a counter-wildlife crime intervention. It's more of an activity that may enhance, the actual application of implementation of a counter-wildlife crime intervention. So it kind of provides information that can then be used to increase the success of another counter-wildlife crime intervention. So it's a bit of an outlier, but important nonetheless to see that it's quite dominant in our findings here. Okay, in terms of population, so I'm going to zoom in on each one of these quickly, but just when you look at overall, the most common species of conservation concern that were evaluated looked at African and Asian elephants, followed by felids, the cats, and turtles and tortoises as species groups. And if we zoom in here, so this is just for Africa, and we can see that we found 16 species groups for Africa, most commonly African elephants, but a number on rhinos, bovids, cats, felids, and primates. And we've stacked these by those broad groupings. For Africa, we see there's quite an even distribution of the broad groupings of counter-wildlife crime interventions. when we look at Asia, we found a lot more species groups, 21, most commonly felids, turtles, and tortoises. But we do see there's a bit more dominance in terms of those wildlife product-centric actions being implemented rather than wildlife population-centric or indigenous distribution. For Latin America, we had even fewer species groups, 12 species groups captured, most commonly parrots and turtles and tortoises. And again, that kind of dominance of the wildlife product-centric interventions. Okay, in terms of just summarizing some of the gaps related to population. So there was an overall paucity of studies on plant groups. So there was, very few rosewoods, studies on mahoganies or cycads, no studies on relevant succulents or aloes or elephant trunks. We also think that there's some potential gaps related to relevant bird species and reptile groups, but especially related to those counter-life crime interventions aimed to protect the wildlife before they're exploited rather than after the fact, right? Outcomes. Okay, so we only found 11% of the evidence-based use a direct measure biological to evaluate counter-life crime intervention. So those abundance biomass kind of intervention. Instead, the vast majority used a threat reduction or the intermediate indicators, in particular wildlife crime and trade levels. So, for example, the number or weight of wildlife contraband confiscated, or the number of products available for sale in markets. Okay, so let's move on to identifying knowledge clusters and gaps. Okay, so how we identify knowledge in clusters is through the use of heat maps. Essentially, it's just a matrix of cells. So where you're trying to relate two things together. So we have our measured outcomes on the top. We have our broad grouping of biological threat reduction intermediate indicators, and we have these finer subcategories within that. And the point of that is to really make sure you want to narrow the focus down. If you're linking two things together, you want to be able to make sure that the indicators used for abundance, for example, are similar enough that you wouldn't necessarily compare them to something like body condition, right? So you want to make sure you're categorizing these cases into subsets of the evidence base, that if you identify a cluster that you can then maybe do something quantitative with, you can combine those studies in a quantitative analysis because they're similar. It's this whole apples to apples, oranges to apples kind of question with mention. And so we're relating it to a particular kind of and essentially just a matrix of counts. It does not provide an indication of the strength of whether or not, patrols or counter-life crime interventions are effective, or the direction, right? It's really just counting how many cases do we have of each of these things. And we can color code it to indicate a darker color would indicate a higher frequency. To do that, this is what we get. So we can immediately see there's a number of clusters that pop up. Just give you a second to take that in. But one of the things I want to kind of relate is that ideally with the clusters, we want to identify subsets of the evidence base that we can then address the question of what does the evidence suggest, right? So to be able to address that question, our ability really depends on how what is available, but it's not just about having enough studies or enough cases, it's about having enough reliable studies. So what does that mean? So in order to be able to address that question, we need to be able to measure a difference. We need some form of comparison to be able to know if something changed, right? And so it needs to include some sort of comparison or counterfactual. What would have happened in the absence of that intervention? So it requires some sort of before data, for example, or a spatial location without that intervention. See, after you've implemented it, is there a change? So you can gauge this by just broadly looking at the study design, right? And we found that only 11% of the evidence-based use some form of a comparator. That's not good, right? That's not good. Instead, most of them are using after-only data, right? So without that comparison, we can't say anything about the question of what the evidence suggests. So if we go back to our heat map, only focus on subsetting this data for the 11% of the evidence base that use some sort of comparator, and we redo the heat map. Ouch. Yeah, exactly. Ouch. Right? And so these are the number of cases. And so in a given study, we were extracting species-specific information. So if they recorded outcomes for that intervention for multiple species, we would have extracted that as a separate case. So the next layer to this is how many studies are actually this coming from, right? So is this just 46 species from one paper? Like if that's the cluster, would we want to do secondary review on one study? No, it's not really helpful in terms of we want to generalize, right, about the effectiveness. So the next layer to this is how many studies is this coming from, right? It gets even more depressing. More depressing. Right? And so really, like we're scratching here, but we identified some clusters, right? First one kind of showing the more promise, right? The effectiveness of patrols on population events. Okay, so I think we got a big list here to go through. So summarize the future needs, right? I think the biggest take home, right, is that the evidence base supporting this is just unreliable. It's unreliable. So we need more robust primary research. And I don't take it for granted that I'm sitting up here saying we need more primary. I know that's not helpful, but I think that's an important take home message nonetheless. So to improve this strength, we need to incorporate comparators in addition to using some sort of experimental design when it's appropriate, right? So we found no experimental designs, none in the evidence base. They were all observational studies. No experimental design. Okay. That's so to kind of like fill in those geographical and taxonomic biases, we also need more related to Latin America and for conserving plants and birds and reptiles. And again, especially aimed at those actions to prevent the loss of the target species from the habitat. Just making a quick note, we did not search or correlate information related to amphibians, fungi, arthropods, or fish. So that could also be a gap. We just did not look at that, right? So really, we found that one cluster and it related to trolls. So basically, any evaluation on non-patrol based counter-crime interventions are needed, especially related to biological outcomes at the population and species level, and ideally accompanied with human well-being outcomes. So we did not include studies that only looked at human well-being outcomes, but if the study, in addition to reporting one of our relevant outcomes, also looked at human well-being outcomes, we did code that, and only 16% of the cases did that. So as others have advocated before, right, we want to also accompany these with human well-being objectives. Okay, so that our final paper, I just want to give a shout out here. Oh, that's not, sorry. Our final paper was published on this as a stage 2 registered report in the same journal as our protocol just back in March. There's tons of supplementary material in there if you want to take a closer look if you're super keen. In terms of a positive sign, right, our results were immediately used in the World Wildlife Crime Report. And Stephen is here. Is right here. And so we gave him kind of a preview of using this data. So it's really nice to actually see that being used and taken up immediately, right? Okay, so on the horizon. So again, right, it's really nice to be able to go from a systematic map, identify some clusters, and then do something to address this question of what does the evidence suggest with a systematic review. And so, right, we have done that with that one cluster that showed some promise, right? It's still a bit of a stretch. It's not 16 studies is not ideal to really draw generalized conclusions, but we have done this. And so this is not published yet. We're kind of in the stages of getting a final draft ready. But I'm just going to give you guys some teasers. I'm not going to go into the full thing and give the full explanation of methods or anything, but I'll just give you some teasers for now. Okay, so the question we could address with this is, are patrols associated with increasing wildlife population abundance of the same species threatened by exploitation? So we did a quantitative evaluation using 2 effect size measures. So from each of those 16 studies, we went in and extracted the quantitative data and calculated an effect size. So that tells you how much of a change, how big of a change, and in what direction are we seeing the effectiveness of patrols. And so we used 2 effect size measures, standardized mean difference using a Hedges G. I don't know if there's any meta-analysis people in the room, but it's essentially, this is considered a more robust effect size. You're able to do a formal, kind of a more formal meta-analysis. But what is required for this is you need to have replication in your comparative data. So if we have before data and after data, you need to have at least 2 of those, right? If you have spatial comparison, you need to have at least 2 of those in each group, right? We only, of the 37 data sets we were able to extract from those 16 studies, was their replication. So there's only a replication in 11. So that was really limiting in terms of what you can really say with meta-analysis. And so to make use of the evidence base, we also use percent change. So it's simple, but you don't need necessarily replication for that, right? So it allowed us to also look at all 37 data sets. But there's a lot of caveats associated with this, right? These are not large sample sizes, so just keep that in mind. Okay, So when we look at, if we combine all of those data sets separately for HSG and separately for percent change, what is the overall effectiveness of patrols? And we're defining this in terms of like, is there a positive? Do we see a positive effect in terms of increasing wildlife abundance? You know, in a spatial location or time period after you've implemented patrols. There's a lot of data, I'm not going to get into it, but really, it's just, we're showing some evidence that patrols are associated with increasing wildlife abundance. So we're seeing an overall average positive effect for patrols in terms of increasing wildlife abundance, and similar here with the percent change. Okay, that's looking at overall, right? But what's really important is the context, right? So what factors influence the effectiveness? What about in certain situations are patrols effective or not effective, right? And so we can include predictor variables in here to kind of test this. We were only able to do this for the percent change. Keep that in mind. There was 11 effect sizes for HSG. It's not enough to add any predictor variables or moderators. So this is just simplistic percent change using non-parametric tests. And so we found some evidence that patrols are more effective for some species groups than others. So for example, so this is just a box filing plot. So anything above the line would indicate a positive, like an increase in the average wildlife abundance, and below there's a decrease, so it's ineffective. And so we found that the abundance of bovids, which are things like dukers, water buffalo, showed a greater increase following patrols compared to other species groups like primates. We found some evidence that patrols conducted in more open habitats with potentially greater visibility are more effective than in closed forested habitats, for example. We found some evidence that patrols conducted by people with law enforcement authority are more effective. Now here we were only able to compare the difference between law enforcement and mixed. We did not have enough for non-law enforcement to look at this. So for these conservation contexts, these findings, right, are a positive signal in some degree, right, in terms of the direction of the evidence. But, you know, we encountered many limitations in the evidence, right? There's a lack of replication. There's a lack of long-term monitoring. Oftentimes they were only monitored for 1-2 years after the control was implemented. And so when you're thinking about these longer lived species, is that a long enough time to see if there's been a change, right? There's also a lot of gaps in the available outcome data. So they might have had replication, but it was like 10 years apart between their monitoring, right? A lot could happen in 10 years, right? To make sure, you know, is that really accurate? And then confounding interventions, right? Patrols are often not implemented alone. Right? There's all other counter-wildlife crime interventions going on. There's a non-counter-wildlife crime interventions being implemented at the same time. So to be able to tease apart, is that the effect of patrols, or is that the effect of combination or something else, right? It's very difficult. And so really, right, the evidence base is not good enough to determine causality, right? The benefit of patrols. So we cannot definitively conclude that the estimated changes that we saw in abundance, you know, are representative of the relationship between patrols and wildlife population. We're just not there yet. So I'm just going to say, stay tuned for the publication of these findings. We're getting there. But importantly, I just want to say that it's going to include the results of that meta-analysis. But importantly, some of our advisory teams now are really helping us to work through this and trying to really dig in and provide guidance in terms of how to improve the evidence-based patrolling. So if you're thinking about testing this, what do you need to consider, right? What should you be considering? Okay, so just some final thoughts. So I think with the map and with this, the meta-analysis on patrols, we've kind of highlighted, you know, where the current research efforts should focus, where we need to direct future research, but more importantly, that we need to improve testing and what conservation tools are most effective. I'm just going to end on a quote by Jen Miller, who's a colleague from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and she's a program officer in illegal wildlife trafficking, combat wildlife trafficking. So as a program officer in donor agencies contributing to projects that combat wildlife trafficking, this study is invaluable feedback. This flashing red light of alarm could lead us to a transformational moment. This isn't just a call for more research, it's a wake-up call to roll out a conservation where we implement interventions while simultaneously testing their